now that we have understood what JavaScript is used in for, let us now learn different ways of defining variables in JavaScript. And in this video, we will discuss three different ways with which you can declare variables. So let us get started with iDigitalPreneur. Now, the first way of declaring a variable, and this is the historically only way with which we could declare variables in the old version of JavaScript, is using the var keyword. Now, to declare a variable in JavaScript or any programming language, as a matter of fact, you first of all define the type of variable that you want to define. So in terms of JavaScript, it could be var, let, and const, and then you name your variable. Now the naming of variable is entirely up to the developer, although there are some rules that you need to follow whenever you are naming your variables. One of them being that your variable names cannot start with a number, but they could definitely start with a special symbol, and they could be any alphanumeric value which you want. So let us say I define a variable by the name of x, and now I can assign a value to this variable x. Now, owing to the fact that JavaScript is a loosely typed language, that means I can dynamically insert any type of data inside of my variable. I don't need to define the type of data which is getting stored in my variable beforehand. This is done in old programming languages like Java and C and C++, where we would need to actually define the data type of the variable beforehand, and then we could only store that type of data in that variable. But with modern day languages like JavaScript and Python, this is no longer the case. You can assign any type of value, any type of data inside of your variable. So let us say I define, and I have defined a value of 2 to my variable x. Now I have defined a variable x with a value of 2. Inside of my memory, inside of my computer memory, there is a memory space now with a label of x, and it has a value of 2 assigned to it. Now I can go ahead and I can use this variable wherever I want. So let's say I want to print this variable. So I will just say console.log and I will run this, and it will give me the value 2. Now, because I have this value 2 inside of my x, I can go ahead and do all sorts of arithmetic operations which one could do with a number. So let us say I do x plus 2. And once I do this, you will see that I'm getting a value of 4. So because JavaScript is a programming language and it is able to do a lot of computations on its own, I can go ahead and create indefinite number of variables inside the scope of my JavaScript. And let's say I want to multiply a value to this variable x. So I will say let or var result is equal to x times 2. And now on line number 10, I will simply console.log of result. Now if I run this, I will again get a value of 4. That is because I'm taking the value of x, multiplying it by 2 and storing that value inside of a variable called result. And I'm console.logging that result. So this is historically the only way with which we could define a variable in JavaScript. Now, var had a lot of issues, and we'll see what these issues were. But let me tell you, before we continue with the discussion of let and const, there is one concept that we need to discuss, and that is the concept of scoping. So what do we mean by scoping? Scoping is essentially the area in which a particular variable has some power. That means whenever you are defining any variable in your JavaScript code, it has a certain scope associated to it. What do I mean by it? So when I am declaring a variable by the name of x and I'm assigning it a value of 2, this x has a scope of global. That means this value x, which has a value of 2, this variable is available in the global scope. So ideally, there are two different scopes which are available. The first scope is what we call a global scope. And global scope is the entire scope of JavaScript. So whatever JavaScript you have written, it runs into a single central scope called a global scope. And then we have smaller subsets of scopes which are called block level scopes. So these are the two different scopes which are available in JavaScript. And whenever you are defining any variable which is outside of these pairs of blocks, they have a scope of global scope, like the example which we have here, variable x is equal to 2. Now let's create a block level scope, and for this what I'm going to do is I am going to create a function. We will see what functions are in a later point of time, but let us create a function, and I will say function to be say hello. And then a block scope or a different scope, a local scope, is defined by a pair of curly braces. So whatever you put inside a pair of curly braces, whether it's of a function, whether it's for a for loop, whether it's for any if else statements, all of these are considered to be block level scopes. So any variable which I define inside of a function, inside of a for loop, inside of a if statement, if else statement, all of that is considered to be a block level scope. And I can define a variable here, and I can say where y is equal to 2. Now this variable y is not available in the global scope because the scope of this y is inside of this function by the name of say hello. So just to prove my point, if I try to do console.log of y, I should get an error saying that y is not defined, and this is what I'm getting, that y is not defined because I am running my y inside of my global scope. That means I'm trying to search for y inside of global scope, but y is present in this block level scope, which is also called a function scope. So block level scopes have different segregations. We have a function scope and we have a normal block scope. We will see what block scopes are inside, but collectively both of them are known as block level scopes. So this is all there is to scoping. And just to summarize what we have done so far, scopes are the areas in which a particular variable or a function definition has power to function. So y only has a power to function inside a pair of these block scopes, and outside of this function, this y has no use and it cannot be accessed. So the problem with var was that var was intentionally a functional scope variable. That means whenever I would declare a var, it would be scoped inside of the function. So let us write a simple piece of code just to understand the problems that var created. So let's say this function is var scoping. So I'm naming this function as var scoping. Don't worry about the function and how the function definitions are working. We will see what function definitions and how to execute a function are once we start off with the function bit. But I'm creating a functional scope here, and I'm saying where y is equal to 2. Now inside of this function, I'm going to go ahead and create another block. So I will say if true, again this is an if else statement, and inside of this if, I'm going to say where y is equal to 3. Now ideally your code intention was that if this particular statement was true, I needed to declare another variable y, this which is independent of this variable y. I need to declare that variable y and assign it a value of 3. So ideally if I do console.log, if I do console.log of y, this should yield me 3. And if I do a console.log of y outside of my if statement, now if statements again, they are themselves block level scoped. So if I do a console.log of y here, you would expect that it would print the value of 2 because this y is equal to 2 and this console.log are in the scope of this function, and this var y is inside of the scope of this particular if else statement block. So if I executed this function, we would face an issue that both of my console.logs y are yielding the value of 3. That means this y is getting printed for this 3, but this console.log of y is also getting printed as 3. And this was a major problem with var because whenever a var would get declared, it would be available in the entire scope of the function. So essentially, when I'm doing var y is equal to 3, this is kind of overwriting the value of y is equal to 2 here. And that is why I'm getting from line number 18, I'm getting a value of 3 as it is. So this was one of the major problems of var, because we could not create precise block level variable declarations, and there would always be something called a name conflict, which we are seeing right now, that even though I intended this y to be scoped inside of this particular if else statement, and I did not want this particular y to be outside of the boundaries of this block statement, yet still this console.log of y is printing me the value of 3. And this was the major problem with var. Now, to tackle this problem, the specifications of let and const were added. So we'll see what let and const are. Now I will write another pair of function, and I'm going to call this let scoping. And I'm going to copy this entire code inside of this function. And instead of using a var, now I'm going to use a let. So now when I execute this function of let scoping, and let's comment this var scoping out because we don't require it anymore. Now, once I execute this function, let's see what the output is. And now the output which I am getting is 3 and 2, which is the intention of the code which I wrote. And this is exactly the major difference between var and let, is that let is block level scoped. That means any let that you define is only contained within that particular block, and it does not overflow or it does not leak outside of the constraints of its block, which is what is happening here. This let y is equal to 3 is only contained inside of this if block, and it is not polluting the value of y outside of this if statement, and that is why I'm getting the value of 3 and 2. So this was an improvement over var, and now most of the code, or rather every JavaScript code that you ever write, we differ from using var. Of course, var has its own use cases, but most of the times you will be using let instead of var to declare a variables which you want it to be reassigned. Now, what do I mean by reassign is, if I have defined a variable using var or let, let's say I do something like this, and then in the next line, I'm going to go ahead and reassign the value of x. Let's say I make it to be 45. And now in the next line, if I do console.log of x, I will no longer get 2, rather I will get the value of 45, because I have reassigned the value of x from 2 to 45. The same thing happens with var. If I have declared a variable using var, a similar characteristic will be seen, that the value are reassigned, but the only major difference which we already saw was the level of scoping which var and let does. Var is a functional level scope, and it will always be available in the entire scope of the function, whilst let will always be available inside of the local block level scope in which it is defined. Now, the final way of defining a variable is called a const, which is short form for constant. And this is exactly what it sounds. It is used to define a constant variable. So let's say if I do const x is equal to, or let's say const pi is equal to 3.14. Now, this variable which I have declared, which is pi is equal to 3.14, this is now immutable. That means even in your later point of code, you cannot go ahead and change the value of pi. So let's say I do this pi is equal to 2, and I do console.log of pi. I will run into an error which will say that pi is a constant variable. It says assignment to a constant variable. That means this line pi is equal to 2 is invalid because pi is actually a constant. So whenever you want to define a variable which will not change its value, and you know that its value is always going to be fixed, you use the defining variable type to be constant and not let or var. So these were the three different ways with which you could define variables in JavaScript. Ideally, var is deprecated, and we no longer use var anymore in defining any of our variables. If you want to have the characteristics of var, instead of var, use let. And whenever you want to define any variable which does not change its value in a later point of time in your code, we use the date defining variable of const. So this brings us to the end of different ways of defining variables. Let's continue our discussion over the basics of JavaScript. I will see you all in the further video.